Hello, I'm Kristen Bolden, and welcome to The Other Side of History. In this talk, we are going to do mostly a summary of the Waldenses. Now, although there is much more very interesting information in this book, Truth Triumphant by B.G. Wilkinson, that we've been going through, I would like to give a brief history, actually kind of a two-part history on the Waldenses, and then I'd like to get right into the history of the Protestant Reformation as found in Daubigny's book, The History of the Reformation of the 16th Century. So a few of the highlights from the book Truth Triumphant that we have not covered is a history of Sabbath keeping in China. There's actually a monument, and it's located in the heart of China. It's made of marble, and it dates back to the 8th century A.D. It was unearthed in 1625. Now, the importance and the significance of the stone is seen on the very face of the monument. It says that it is a monument commemorating the propagation of the Tai Chin luminous religion in the Middle Kingdom. Now, Tai Chin is the Chinese name for Judea and the region pertaining to Christianity. The monument also says, "On the seventh day, we offer sacrifices after having purified our hearts and receive absolution for our sins. This religion, so perfect and so excellent, is difficult to name, but it enlightens darkness by its brilliant precepts." So the book, Truth Triumphant, by B.G. Wilkinson. It also talks about Sabbath keeping in India. The historian Migana proves that as early as 225 A.D., there existed a large presence of the Church of the East, stretching from Palestine to the surrounding India. Now, Plato, he once said, "Those who tell the stories rule society." The story of the Waldenses has been retold by the Church of Rome. Many historical books, they refer to the Waldenses as being formed from the efforts of a single Christian man named Peter Waldo, who lived in the 12th century. Peter Waldo, also known as Pierre Valde or Valdo, was a rich merchant of Lyons. He was born in 1140 and died in 1218. He sold all of his goods and he gave them to the poor. It appears that his aim, as well as that of his friends, was to reestablish the perfection of the primitive Christianity. His preaching was powerful because he appealed to the scriptures, and it shook the Roman hierarchy to its foundations. But Peter Waldo was not the founder of the Waldenses. This theory was created only to try to hide the existence of the Waldensian Church as a church that existed as early as the Apostolic Age. Now, Truth Triumphant says, Roman Catholic writers try to evade the apostolic origin of the Waldenses, so as to make it appear that the Roman is the only apostolic church, and that all others are later novelties. And for this reason, they try to make out that the Waldenses originated with Peter Waldo of the 12th century. Dr. Peter Alex says, "Some Protestants, on this occasion, have fallen into the snare that was set for them. It is absolutely false that these churches were ever founded by Peter Waldo. It is pure forgery. It is not true that Waldo gave his name to the inhabitants of the valleys. They were called Waldenses before this time, from the valleys in which they dwelt." So as another historian explains, Peter Waldo actually received his religious understanding from the Waldenses, who lived in the Waldensian valleys. It's interesting that even Voltaire, he speaks of the Waldenses existing long before Peter Waldo, and that the Church of Rome thought it proper to alter the roots there of their origin. So why would Rome want to do this? Well, if it can be proven that the Waldensian Church is the oldest Christian church, and that the Waldensian Bible is the oldest Bible, what does that make Rome out to be? A counterfeit Christian system, doesn't it? As the book Truth Triumphant brings out, these apostolic Sabbath-keeping Christians who had a pure Bible evangelized places like China and India shortly after the time of the apostles. Rome's motto has always been, what you cannot destroy, falsify. And the history of the Waldenses has most definitely been falsified. Ellen White, in her book, Great Controversy, says, through ages of darkness and apostasy, there were Waldenses who kept the true Sabbath. Not only has Rome sought to make the Waldenses a relatively recent group, but they have also tried to make it out that they were not even Sabbath keepers. So while touring the Waldensian valleys, some have actually asked about the Waldenses' Sabbath-keeping practices from those that were the early Waldenses. And they're disappointed to hear that the early Waldenses always observed Sunday, and that there's no proof of them ever worshiping on the Seventh-day Sabbath. Now there's a collection of 5 books written against the Waldenses. They were written from about 1241 to 1244, and they were written by a Dominican inquisitor. His name was Father Monita of Cremona, who resided in northern Italy. Now Monita, he passionately defended himself against criticism from the Waldenses at that time that Romanists were transgressors of the Sabbath commandment. In one of his chapters, he discusses the significance of the Seventh-day Sabbath of Exodus 28, where it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And he contrasts this with the value of the Lord's Day, his term for the first day of the week. Now, Monita, he claimed that the Sabbath was for the Jews. The Jewish Sabbath, he said, was a sign and figure of the spiritual Sabbath of the Christian people. He says, it must be understood, however, that as the Jews observed the Sabbath, so also we observe the Lord's Day. This day we observe as an ordinance of the church. It is in reverence of Christ, who was born on that day, who rose on that day, who sent the Holy Spirit on that day. So these writings of Monita, they clearly show that there was a sizable group of Waldenses in northern Italy and southern France during the 13th century, and they were worshiping on the Seventh-day Sabbath. Now, what led to the Waldenses in northern Italy to start giving up their Sabbath keeping was a meeting that took place. And this meeting took place in 1532. The meeting was between the Waldenses and representatives of the French Reformation. So at this time, many, if not most of the Waldenses, they voted to join the French Reformation. They stopped training their itinerant preachers, they actually called them barbs, and instead they sent their pastoral candidates there to Geneva, Switzerland, to be educated by John Calvin and his associates. Now, Calvin believed that the Sabbath still had significant spiritual, meaning, but that the literal seventh day was ceremonial and a shadow. Basing his view on the same scriptural passages as that inquisitor had used against the Waldenses. Here is seen the power of a false education. The new generation of pastors that were educated under Calvin, They no longer taught the Seventh-day Sabbath, and they began to promote Sunday as the day of worship. We must never give up the truths that the Bible has in order to belong to some kind of a movement. Also, it is a fall of Protestantism when they forget that Rome never changes. During the reign of Pope Pius IV, which was from 1559 to 1565, there was a count and a chief commissioner, and his name was Philip of Savoy. Now, although he was an earnest Roman Catholic, he was a humane and an upright man. He attended a sermon one day in the Waldensian church, and he was so much pleased with what he had heard that he obtained from the pastor an outline of the Waldensian faith. And he desired to have this outline of their faith, so to send it to Rome. So he did this. He sent it to Rome in the hope that the Pope would cease to persecute a creed that seemed to be so little heretical. Anyhow, it was a sanguine hope indeed. Where the honest count had seen very little heresy, Pope Pius IV, he saw a great deal. And he would not permit a disputation with the Waldensian pastors, as the count had proposed. So the life of the Waldenses, it was in stark contrast to the rest of the world that was around them. They were without blame, and this blamelessness actually became like a proverb. If one did not participate in the vices of his day, he was suspected of being a Waldensian. As one man of the day put it, if there be an honest man who desires to love God and fear Jesus Christ, who will neither slander, nor swear, nor lie, nor commit adultery, who will not kill, nor steal, nor avenge himself of his enemies, they presently say of such a one that he is a Waldensian and worthy of death. We all have a hole in our heart that can only be filled with Christ. The Waldenses, they understood this, and by their quiet country lifestyle and right living, they achieved the peace and the joy that can only come by having this relationship with Christ and following his principles. None were better subjects to the king than the Waldenses, or the Waldensian. The more they feared God, the more they honored the king. Their services, their substance, their life were all at the disposal of their prince. They were willing to lay them down in defense of their prince. They were willing to lay them down in defense of his lawful prerogative. One thing only they could not surrender, and that was their conscience. So to conclude, the Waldenses were the first real Protestants. Protestantism did not come from the Reformation of the 16th century. In reality, it was the Reformation that came from Protestantism. As J.A. Wiley wrote in his history of the Waldenses, the antiquity of the Waldenses is the antiquity of Protestantism. Also, D'Aubigné said in his history of the Reformation of the 16th century, Huss and Jerome, Luther and Calvin did little more than carry on the work begun by the Waldensian missionaries. As the Bible teaches that the woman fled into the wilderness for that 1260 days or years, the Waldenses, they lived during this time of 1260 years of persecution. And they dwelt in the mountains where they were protected there by the wildness of the region. The Roman soldiers who ventured these rugged, slippery, and dangerous trails were weary when they finally did get to their victims. The Pope had absolved them from all ecclesiastical pains or penalties if they joined the cause in exterminating the Waldenses, the Waldensian people there. As a result, there were many vagabond adventurers. There were ambitious fanatics, reckless pillagers, and merciless assassins. At the end of this world's history, God's people will again experience what the Waldensians experienced. However, just as God was there for Joseph there in Egypt, and Elijah with Jezebel, and Jeremiah in the pit, and then there's those three worthies in the furnace, God was there for them. And he will also be there for us. He'll be our refuge and our strength, that ever-present help in time of need. So at this time, I would just like to encourage you to click on that subscribe and like button if you've enjoyed this talk. And I want to thank you for listening. And God bless.